What up, team? Welcome back to the EPL Ethos Pathos Eternal Logos podcast. I like that. It's a good introduction. This is a very special podcast. It is the very first one with discussion, and it is a special guest, my sister. She is obviously, I promised you guys, she's beautiful. She's with us today. It's the first podcast of the year, so there's a lot to celebrate, and many more to come in the future. So today, we're gonna hop right into the topic, right into the discussion. But I just kind of wanted to go through just a few things, just do a bit of an introduction for my sister Saray. I call her Saray. Her name's actually Milosha, but I'll give her an opportunity to introduce herself. But like I said, first podcast of the year, first discussion, a lot of firsts here, and I'm particularly happy to have her on because, as I mentioned in one of the other podcasts, she has been one of the ones pushing me to actually get this going. And so it's only fitting that she is the first one on the podcast. So, Saray, go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us, what your name is, whatever you want to tell the people out there, friends, family, etc. So,
Hey everybody. I'm here with the little bro. He is the little brother of the family. So I'm just super excited to be here just to kind of, talk, chat it up, and just talk about whatever Michael wants me to talk about. So, like you said, my name is Milosha Saray. I do a little of a lot. What do they say? Master of none.
jack of all
I don't
trades,
know. Jack of all
master of
trades,
none.
master of none.
Yeah.
But you can find me though on all social media platforms at Milosha. So I'm sure Micah will put the spelling of my name somewhere at the bottom of the screen. But I am super happy to be here. We have been talking about this forever. So we are here live and yeah, ready to chat it up.
Perfect. Yes, and I will definitely have all of our social media links, uh, website stuff in the description. So you guys don't worry about that. That will be there. I thought the first thing we could probably discuss is the podcast itself, right? So just a little bit about sort of what you think about the podcast so far. Like I said, seeing how
Yeah.
you've been the one to sort of push me to kind of get it actually going and out the door. I mean, how long have I been talking about doing this thing for a long time? And so kind of get your thoughts on the podcast. If there's something or one of the episodes that I've had prior to this one, any critiques or feedback, because like we kind of sort of discussed a little bit before we actually started the recording. I want this podcast to be discussionary. I want people to come on and start to discuss some of the ideas, because I think healthy discourse and dialogue is one of the best ways to learn, and get and grow together, and also understand each other's perspectives and those kinds of things. So I think it would be perfect to have sort of you kind of give me, sort of a live rendition of kind of what you think about the podcast, and we can kind of start there.
Yeah. So let me just say I'm so proud of you, brother, just for just stepping out on faith and just kind of doing what part of your purpose is. I think so many of us we're fearful, right? We're nervous about kind of jumping out there and just kind of living our dreams and living our purpose. So I commend you for doing that. You're my little bro, so I mean, you could be singing ABCs on here, and I'd be like, yes,
Maybe I
that
will.
was a
Maybe I'll
great
do
A.
ABC.
This is an awesome B. But yeah, so I think the podcast idea is perfect for you. As you and I have talked about in the past, I think you just have just a great way of thinking. You're young, you're millennial, you have um, just a different way of thinking about things. And I think most millennials have. So I think your take on what you're trying to bring to YouTube and to the podcast world, I think is very unique. So one of the things that I think is unique about your perspective is your faith and how you've just lived your life since you were a little baby boy, right?
Yeah.
So you've always kind of lived above the standard, right? So I think you have just such a unique perspective on how a young Christian, not saying that this is a Christian platform per se, this is
Right.
a thinking platform,
Right.
but the way that you've just kind of thought about things and approached things ever since you were little has always been just unique. So for you to bring that to the world and to the podcast platform, I think is just going to be amazing. So I just see good things happening.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And this will not be interview style, but just kind of like kind of say, like, so tell me about your perspective. Right? It will definitely be
Yeah.
discussion over. I appreciate that, Saray. Like, I think it's always been a part of me to sort of learn and share. I think, growing up, um, be it that it's four of us, and grew up in the same house together. I was in a position, as I think a lot of youngest siblings are, in a position to sort of learn from the older siblings. And I think my perspective on that, and I've learned a lot from each one of you. I could probably talk all day about what I've learned from each one of my siblings. But I think it's kind of sort of always been in me to sort of do that. And I think that in combination with my, personality and all those things. But thank you. I think it's really nice to hear anyone say that, especially your big sister, because it's just like you said, I think it's just something that's in me to sort of want to learn, grow, share, and then actually sort of be a help in that way. And that's exactly like you said, what this podcast is intending to be about. It's a thinking podcast to help people understand the notion of thinking, what thinking is, what epistemology is. I've always sort of had an intellectual bone in my body, so being open to hearing that intellectual perspective, and then try to take that and break it down in such a way for listeners to be able to dissect and actually understand, and recognize it doesn't have to be anything scary, because I understand it. Like, sometimes when you get on certain topics when they're taboo, it can just be a little scary to get into. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and let me just say this too. I think in these last days, I think it's going to be very important for people to have a thinker, right? So right now it's a lot of clutter. It's a lot of noise
Right.
out there on social media. There are all different types of opinions. But I think as things go along and as social media matures, and I think that as we get more and more messages, it's going to be important for people to have a place to go
Right.
to think about some of these ideas that have been presented. And this is where I think your podcast is going to fit in, because there's a lot of junk, right?
Right.
It's a lot of noise, there's a lot of junk out there. But in the last days, people are going to need a place to process what is going on, because we haven't seen the worst of it.
Right.
So I don't want to get too deep, because we're going to keep this super fun and
Yep.
super light
Yep. Yep.
and just talk about certain subjects. But I do want to touch down on the importance of podcasts such as this.
Yeah. Absolutely.
You may only have however many followers now,
Right.
but I think as time and things go on, I think your following is going to grow, because as institutions are falling, as the Bible tells us in Revelation, that people are going to need some place to go.
Right.
And where do we go for
Right.
information now?
Yep.
We go to social media.
Yep.
We go to
Absolutely.
the internet for information. So
Yep.
I just wanted to add that part on, because what you see now may not be what is to come. So
Right.
to start your purpose, to walk in this particular purpose that you have in this particular platform, I think is going to be super important for you to do. So I
Right.
think that's going to be a unique place that you're going to fit.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I receive that 100%. And I think at its core, and I think what I've been trying to do over the last couple of podcasts is lay down a foundation for understanding very foundational principles, right? And there was a philosopher, it might have been Thomas Nagel, don't quote me on that, but and other philosophers may have echoed this as well. But it's important to think about thinking. And I think when you do that, that gives you a means and a way of self-reflecting, not on yourself, but on your culture. And like you said, social media is just a massive part of our culture today and moving forward. I don't see it going anywhere anytime soon, right? And it's going to, like you said, mature, and it's going to change, and it's going to evolve. The technology that's created is going to sort of push that into our future. And I think being able to self-reflect and go internal, as opposed to simply just hearing information, spitting that information back out, right? Being able to actually take that information and process it and understand what your actual take is on it. Understand once you've drawn certain conclusions, the claims that are going to come from those conclusions that you've drawn, and also understanding how that draws itself all the way back to your most foundational principles, beliefs, etc. Right? And so, I think it's super important, and I think that's why. And again, I thank you so much for making me stand in my ear about actually getting this started and going. So that's awesome. Is there anything in the podcast that I've seen that you've seen so far that you think, and it's could be a no, and we can sort of jump into the topic that we have for tonight, which you kind of already mentioned. But is there anything in the previous podcast that you've seen, or anything that I've said that you might not understand, or something you've heard that you have an idea about that you can think of that might be interesting to discuss, or just talk about, or agree or disagree?
I could bring something up. I think that what people would want to take from it, well, what everybody takes from it is what they take from it. But I think one of the things that's important to kind of recognize is for your listeners and your viewers to come out with some sort of a template, like some sort of a way I'm going to think about things. Because it is important to think about thinking, because like you said, there's so many things going on that there is going to come a reflection time, like where you want to be like, okay, wait, stop. There's so much, going on in the world. How do we process it? How do we break it down? And then how do we respond, to it for ourselves, our communities, and our families, right? Ourselves, our families, and our communities. So I think what's important for folks to maybe grasp, or what I've grasped from it, is to kind of challenge the way I think. How am I going to process information? Am I going to use science? Am I going to use religion? Am I going to use some combination of the two? Am I going to use Facebook? Am I going to use what my mama told me? Right? So how do I process that into something that works for me? So I would just challenge viewers and listeners to create, whatever Micah is putting out there, to then challenge even that and create your own kind of template for how I'm going to think.
Right, exactly. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because no matter who we are, I think we as human beings sort of need a place that we come from when it comes to having or generating ideas. And I think everybody to some degree is making an attempt, regardless of the argument or debate or perspective that you might have on something, or the position you might hold. We all want that to be backed up in something that's real and truthful, right? And so challenging what you think is real and truthful at its core helps you get to that place where you can make sound arguments, or you can have a sound perspective, right? And I've mentioned on the podcast before, it's not, like you just said as well too, it's not a religious podcast, it's a thinking podcast. So it's really intended to say whatever it is that you hold to be true. Make sure that you're not just getting information from a third party, like a Facebook. Somebody might have posted something that you agree or disagree with, right? But just to also go internally and say, does this make sense relative to what I think and what I hold to be true? And then,
exactly.
And then what happens is when you do that, or you become better at doing that, you will find that you become, like we said, self-reflective, and then that will start to give you sort of this thinking cycle to where you can start to correct your own perspective, right? And then subsequently get closer to the truth, right? Because
Right.
whatever the truth is, that's unbending. That won't move, right? There are certain truths about our reality that just hold true whether we think so or not. And so if you're able to self-reflect and you're honest about it and you have a good way and you've built yourself, like I said, a good template of doing so, then that will actually help you get closer to what it is you say you're committed to, the truth, reality, and embedded in everybody's perspective is everybody thinks that they're right about what they think, right? And that's right. Ultimately, what people are supposed to be trying to get to, right? And so I think, yeah, I mean, I'm just glad you mentioned that. And everybody, whether, like you said, be religion, science, social media, everybody is going to use something to try to build that strong core foundation from a beliefs perspective, right? And they're going to use that as their bedrock at which to make arguments and make conclusions. So something that the topic of tonight, when we were discussing, we were kind of going back and forth over the last couple of weeks trying to get this together, and we in the last minutes as we can do, which is great. We decided to talk about social media, and you just mentioned it a few minutes ago, which is great. You come from a time, or you grew up in a time where social media was not nearly as prevalent, right? I also grew up in a time where it wasn't, but I wasn't as old to know, sort of the impact, so to speak. I'm 10, and social media started to kind of take its form. At that point, the internet started to become a bigger and bigger thing. So I kind of wanted to get your perspective from, you growing up in a time where there was no social media, and then also get your take, pros and cons of social media, given the change and the impact that you think it's had on us as human beings, right? In the perspective of thinking about thinking, right? Yeah. So what's sort of, well, when you were growing up, what was that like?
Yeah, so thanks for making me feel like super ancient and old. I appreciate that, Micah. Um, yeah, so no, but it's all good. In the spirit of thinking, I think social media is good, right? Because it exposes us to many different ideas than what we would have had prior. Um, us growing up as preachers' kids, the way
Mm-hmm.
we thought
Mm-hmm.
was highly embedded in Christianity,
Mm-hmm.
and it was highly embedded in what the Bible says
Right.
and hermeneutics and things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
So social media has opened up so many more ideas that I think it has kind of almost made us kind of question
Mm-hmm.
what we have been thinking prior to,
Mm.
because you're seeing different perspectives and you're like, hold on, like this sounds like it's wrong, but people are still kind of progressing and
Mm.
moving forward. And you look at yourself and you're like, well, wait a minute, I've been thinking real Christian.
Right.
So how come
Yeah. Yeah.
it seems like this group of people may be a little further? Or so I think just in terms of having social media now versus having it before is that it opens up our minds
Mm.
to different ideas and allows us to kind of challenge what we've been taught and what we've thought prior to.
Mm-hmm.
But what I also think is not having social media and having social media now, I almost feel sorry for the Gen Zs, right? Or
Mm.
like the Gen Ys who have only grown up in social media,
Mm.
because it can be so superficial and it moves so quickly
Right.
that it's like, okay, what do I stay grounded in?
Right. Right.
So not having social media has allowed me to kind of be grounded, right? So
Mm.
just in certain laws, certain principles. Um, it has allowed it's challenged it. So I kind of feel like it's beneficial to have both worlds.
Hmm.
To
Absolutely.
have none, right? And then to have everything. I feel very blessed to be in this particular spot.
Right.
Um, growing up with just social media, I could see that being very challenging. So I'm
Hmm.
not surprised, right, at
Right.
all by what some of the Gen Zs and some of the Gen Ys
Yeah.
are going through right now
Yeah.
because of social media.
Yeah. Let me ask a question actually. When did you see the transition? Like, um, did you at what age were you where you kind of started to see, the world start to transition into the social media age? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like,
For me, I kind of saw the change, honestly, not that long ago. I would say like really about 10 or 12 years ago.
okay.
Did I really start seeing a change
Hmm.
in the effects on how, and that's not to say that social media started 12 years ago.
Right.
It's just
Right.
to say when you really started
The
people
impact.
seeing people
Right.
really
Right.
kind of like,
Right.
oh, did you check your Facebook? Oh, my MySpace. Oh, my, and it's just
Right.
like,
Right.
well, what is this
Yeah.
Facebook that people are talking about? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm missing out on something. So I just started seeing it being super important. I say for me,
Hmm.
I say about 10, 12 years ago.
Yeah.
And like I said, I'm not an expert, and I'm not saying that it started then,
Right.
but just the impact, like
Yeah.
how important it became to people.
Right.
Um,
Right.
10, maybe 10, 12, maybe 15 years, but definitely not that long ago when you
Right.
think about it.
Yeah. And I asked that question because I think when you talk about the impact, and I think that's really like when history looks back at social media, I think that will be the question, right? It's not necessarily when the technology came about or when it was available, but rather when people found it important, right? And I think when we're talking about this thinking thing, it's I can see on the one hand where you're saying like, okay, like people, Gen Y, Gen Z who grew up and they know nothing else but social media almost, right? You get this flood of ideas and opinions and you don't really know sort of where to go or who you are. You know what I'm saying? The the benefit of social media, like you said, has been to sort of get those ideas out there, which is great. But it, kind of has a counter impact, right? Because it's kind of like in a time when you grew up, what else could you have known, right? For some
Right.
people, and some people,
Exactly.
depending upon your perspective when you grew up, right, and what culture you grew up in, that could have been very, very, that could have been subtle, or it could have been broad, right? But I think for some people, the idea, if we're just thinking about it in a very, very, at a very base level, it's like, okay, if I grew up in this place and under, in my parents' household, and I only had this group of friends, and your circle didn't go beyond that, right? You're
Hmm.
influenced by those individuals in that small circle. And so with the
Right.
introduction of social media, it's like now you're influenced literally by the entire world, right? At the push of
Exactly.
a button. And so yeah, that's kind of why I want to dig a little bit into the pros and cons, because it's kind of like it's great to have ideas out there and it's great to have an open mind, but you don't want to have such an open mind where your brain falls out of your head, so to speak, right? And so
Exactly. Yeah.
I've heard a lot of people say, like a lot of people smarter than me say like we don't quite know how to handle social media, right? Like in a very base understanding, like human beings weren't like, if you think from an evolutionary perspective, it's just like we can't handle social media. Like we don't really
No.
know how to handle this much information coming at us from all angles. And some of it's real, some of it's fake. We got memes, we got trolls, we got we literally everything you can
A
imagine.
whole other
It
world
is a
now,
whole new
like
world.
a whole other language
Right.
just to
Right.
kind of deal and function in social media land. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And so like from that, it's like now that we are heavily ingrained, so ingrained in social media that now even our parents are using it. I think when it first showed up, you kind of had our parents didn't really know how to use phones and those kinds of things. And now, like, everybody's using a phone and everybody can get on social media. And wow, our mom may only have two pictures on Facebook. She knows, she's doing it. You know what I'm saying? And
Yeah.
so, as a result of that, what do you think is or has been like this, if we're talking about the cons, right? Because I think that most people are usually interested in the controversy. But if we're thinking about the cons, in terms of thinking, what do you think has been the biggest con from a social media perspective in terms of how people think?
Yeah. I think the way people think about social media is they kind of take it as fact
Right.
or like Bible. Like they take it more, like they put more stock in it, I
Right.
think, than they really should.
Right.
So it's kind of like, oh, I saw this on social media, so it must be true. It's like you say, what?
Right.
Like because you saw it on social media, and I mean not pictures of family. I mean like things about thinking, right? Like
Right.
how folks should be thinking about love, thinking about marriage, thinking
Mm-hmm.
about my black brothers and sisters, thinking about our white counterparts. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, because social media said it, it's like automatic. It's like, oh, this has to be true,
Right.
instead of just kind of thinking about it for yourself and kind of challenging that idea and saying, hey, do I really feel that way, or am I just kind of going along with what social media has said or what
Right.
Twitter has said or what the most popular opinion is?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it has in that respect a very negative impact,
Right.
because people kind of take, it's like, well, if Facebook said it, if Twitter's saying blah blah blah, and it's like,
Right.
y'all, it's Twitter.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
that doesn't mean really anything.
Right. Yeah. It's like, yeah, it kind of creates a hive mind, right? It's like, okay,
Yeah.
if enough people are saying this, then even if, and it's weird because I think even if even if you have the notion of when something's said, you just like, I don't like, even if you don't agree with it, like even if you when you read something, you're just like, you that sort of conscious thought that comes to mind, like I don't think that's true, but if enough people say it,
Right.
the psychological impact is to say, well, I don't want to challenge the grain, right? I don't want to. It's like high school, right? It's just like it's like why would I go against what
True. It's
everybody's saying, right? Like so,
so high
I'm just
school.
gonna take right, and it's not, and it's in my opinion, it's not good. And I think this is the point of sort of a podcast like this, where it's just like, okay, like you don't have to go with the grain, right? Like you don't have to just agree with the most popular opinion. You can have an opinion
Yeah.
of your own, but what you want to do is you just want to make sure that your opinion is grounded in something that's reliable, right? And
Exactly.
what that helps you do is it helps you reflect and say, okay, well, this is who I am, this is what I believe, and the opinion that I have developed on this thing, that goes against the grain when challenged, because you will be challenged, right? When you go against the grain, almost certainly, right? You want to have something to say, right? You don't want to just say, I'm going against the grain just because then you're not in a good position to convince anybody of the truth of your arguments, right? But rather you want to have something actually foundational, or something that's actually going to be able to hold water and keep the conversation going, and hope to break sort of through that hive mind mentality, right? And actually, this is something I was thinking about. I'm actually curious to know what you think. But there's a lot of chat, and we're talking about the social media era versus not social media era. The social media era has brought in a very in a lot of the ideas that we're discussing, a very modern. It's probably one of the coined terms that we're using, which is a direct challenge to tradition, right? And I think you see that in all kinds of topics. You see that in every single, whether it be religious, whether it be relationship, whether it be even in, I think we're starting to see it in some of the, intellectual disciplines as well too, right? The challenge of tradition. And I think some of the things, and I think we have a couple of example posts that we might want to go through and take a look at. But when it comes to just the simple idea of challenging tradition for the sake of challenging tradition, right, is one of those hive mind mentality things, right? Because in my mind, like when you were growing up, right, if there was, to me, tradition has come about in a very base in a very base understanding. I haven't done the research. I'm not an expert, but tradition is the result of years and years and years and years of trial and error to some degree, right? Even if we won't always say like, okay, if there is this tradition, we'll say tradition A, right? If there's a tradition that we follow, that's not to say that it is always the case, but it's just to say that it's traditional because we've found essentially that it works this way pretty well, right? That doesn't mean it can't be challenged. That doesn't mean that we can't change it or improve upon it, but it just is simply to say that like, this is developed over X amount of time and it just works efficiently this way. Versus the modern, let's just challenge it just because it's tradition. The danger in that is when you challenge, it's like, if you ever heard that saying, it says like, before you remove a fence, make sure you know why it was put up in the first place. Sort of that sort of idea. And I'm all for challenging when appropriate, right? But if it's not appropriate, if again, we were talking about, if you have a solid reason for being able to challenge something like tradition, then you have to be able to explain it and have it make sense to those of us who would see the benefit in the tradition, right? In order for us to sort of change our perspective on what that thing might be, right? So what do you think about that? Like just this idea of challenging tradition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, yeah. Challenging tradition it's a very tricky thing because traditions don't necessarily have to be based in fact. They just are traditional.
Right. Right.
But it doesn't mean necessarily that they have ever worked. It just means that that's how we've done it.
Right.
In my line of work, we say you could be in procurement, which is what I do, for 30 years, so for 40 years, but you could have been doing one type of contract for 30 or 40 years.
Right.
That doesn't mean that there aren't 8 or 10 other kinds of contracts that you don't know. So just because you have this idea of tradition, we've just been doing it this way, and this is just the way we're going to do it. It doesn't mean it's working. It doesn't mean that it's right, quote unquote, right. So I think social media and some of the ideas that the younger generation are putting out there are awesome because it does challenge tradition in that way. It does say, well, just because this has been going on doesn't necessarily mean that it worked for a subset of people that could have been oppressed, it could have affected. So social media gives a voice to those who may even share in that tradition, but it may be tweaked in a way where the tradition needs to evolve, not necessarily change, but there's an evolution aspect to tradition. So hopefully, we can get into some of that, because then that is about interpretation, right? So then we gotta be talking about the times and how relevant it is to the time. So just on the point that you asked me, as far as, challenging traditions and things like that, 100%. I think it doesn't need to be like if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? But who's to say that it isn't broken just because we've been rolling on these 2 bicycle wheels, right? Maybe there's a new and improved, bicycle wheel that'll get us all there quicker and better.
Right, absolutely. And I think it's like, it's there's so many levels, right? Because like to your point, right? Like, well, one would need to be able to define what would this broken mean in the first place, right? Like we can go to like that level of, but assuming that like, I think the balance, I think, is sort of like we were talking about sort of what this podcast and potentially others like it will hope to do, right? It will say, okay, let's challenge the status quo. Let's challenge the tradition. Not just those things, but let's challenge everything. Even a new thought that we'll just, we'll pull up maybe a post on social media that might have just popped up, right? Somebody just quoted this and all of a sudden it gets quoted virally on the internet. Whatever it is, if we're going to get to the heart and the truth of it, determine if it's a good idea, determine if it's a broken idea, and all those things. There's a natural progression in evolution that you can have. And just to simply, go in and say, well, I don't agree with this thing because, and I think the great challenge to sort of thinking in this way will be oftentimes reactionary or emotional response in terms of, like, it's like if there is something let's just say we take a sound idea, tradition, or modern day thought, and I see that thing has caused me some kind of pain, right? Then I'm more natural to reject it. And so what happens is if someone out there on social media or otherwise says it or has a topic or is discussing that idea, I'm just more likely to reject the idea and also reject the person that's saying it without being able to effectively find the truth in what they're saying. And I think, like I said, there's just so many layers to that, right? And so I think social media has given us has put this front and center, right? Because you have people from all different walks of life, right? You have people out there who will sit down and deeply think about these things, and there are people out there who will just post instantaneously without even thinking about what they posted, right? And then so what you get, the pro of social media is a discussion, right, between the two extremes and everything in between. You know what I'm saying? So I think with that being, do you have anything on that thought right there? We can, because I think all right.
No, I think you said, I'm about to put my glasses on because like you are hitting the nail on the head. I think that's exactly what social media does. It just puts it out there in a way. Yeah. I mean, So actually, I got nothing on that.
Let me actually ask that real fast. In growing up, when did you because social media has really forced it on us. You know what I'm saying? Like back in the day, it wasn't just like, if there is a thought, let's just take the traditional approach. If there was some tradition that people were following, for whatever reason, if there was some new thought or new idea, usually that new thought or new idea was a transmission through media, right? Not social media, music,
radio, television,
exactly.
cable,
right? But that didn't necessarily force conversation between the traditional mindset and a new idea, more of a modern approach, the way that social media has. Because everybody didn't have a voice, right? It was a few people had a voice, and you would want, to some degree, for those people who had a voice in radio, social media, music, to be a representation of how you felt and who you were. Right. So then if we're thinking about, if there is a particular genre of music, right, like rock and roll, hip hop, you know what I'm saying? Like that was the whole debate at that time. Right. It's just like parents were like, oh, we're scared of this because this is going to, in their mind, pollute our child's mind, in a very, very simple way of thinking about it. Right. But that was carrying some new ideas. Right. And so, but now today in social media, it's like, well, I don't even need rock and roll star to tell me, or represent my thoughts. I can just do it right now and tell the entire world. And I can tell you, right? Like, I don't have to even hope that the message gets to you or get enough people to where it becomes like, I can email you right now. I can Twitter you right now, right? Like at Saray, right? And tell you what I think.
Right.
And so growing up, like, do you feel like that's been the case, or do you feel like that there has been, at least, in growing up, you felt like that it was forced, the way that social media is forcing us to do it today?
100%. And I'll even go as far as to say we rejected it, right? Like my age group, like the Gen Xers, like we kind of were adverse to it. We were like, what is this social media? What are these kids talking about? This is how things should be. This is how they are. Because we were really the revolutionaries, and to a certain degree, right? Like Gen X, because We were the first to know how to operate and work and incorporate the PCs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we were that kind of rebel generation that
Mm,
kind of walked in this whole computer, PC, information, whatever age, right? Like
right.
we were kind of like the leaders in the charge. That was our generation. So we were like, psh, we're the bomb. Like the
Right.
way we think about this, like we got this, right?
Right. Yep.
But you're right because so I think to some degree we were adverse
Mm,
to the accepting social media. And that's why I said for me, and I'm sure other Generation X's like me,
mm-hmm.
we didn't really jump on the bandwagon at first. We
Right.
weren't really like, oh, let's send these texts. What is Instagram? It was all about kind of Facebook. We were kind of like friends of friends. Like, who wants to do that? So we were kind of adverse to it.
Right.
But then social media is such a big machine and you need it for so many different reasons that we can, discuss. We kind of got on the bandwagon
Mm.
with it all.
Do you think? Last question that we can kind of go because I know we want to get to some of these posts. Do you
No,
think
you're fine.
that? Do you think in any way, shape, or form? Obviously, there's a technological element, right? Do you think in terms? Do you think there's ever? Are we going to go back? Do you think there is any going back to a more sort of everybody sort of conforms to these major ideas sort of thing,
Question.
you know what I'm saying? Because the danger, the a con, right, is let's just say we get some idea out in the air and it in reality, in the truth, it's as close to perfect as we can make it, right? Do you think the advent, the coming along of social media over the time period has given people such a voice that now they'll just challenge, right? Just to simply challenge. And so it will sort of, you'll get this diminishing returns, right? Where it's just like, oh, it's great. Let's get new ideas out there. Let's correct the old, right? But then sometimes it's like, okay, at some point it's just like, we might not be able to get better than this, right? And my mind goes to different political discussions out there. We talk about different socioeconomic ways of governing bodies of people, capitalism versus socialism, right? We can look at, for instance, democracy and say it's one of the best forms of government if you have that perspective that we've ever had, right? And so, but you still have a lot of people out there who may challenge the ideas of democracy, right? Even though it's the best one we have so far. Let's just say that would be the case, right? Do you think that like there will ever come a time when we get back to more of a traditional sort of way of thinking where it's like this is uniform now, this should be the standard, this is what we should push to, and all of those new ideas we should be like, nope, not accepting the new ideas because that's going to mess up what we got, we spend so
No,
much
we
time.
have enough new ideas.
Right. You know what I'm saying?
Twitter is maxed
Right.
out. To be honest with you, no. I think we're all gonna die.
Yeah.
Like social media is gonna kill
It's
us
gonna
all.
correct, it's
If
gonna
the
blow
damn
up.
pandemic doesn't kill us, social media is. That's honestly what I feel like. Social media is such a machine, right? So the short answer is no. I think it's
Mm,
going to eat us all alive, to be
mm,
honest with you. I
mm,
don't think that there ever be a time where we will kind of compile it all because our brains are not going to be able to accept,
right.
right, and be able
Right.
to process. Do I think that there should be um do I think that some people will, right, conform to what you're saying and say,
Mm,
you know what, that's it, this is what it is,
right.
this is all I'm going to believe, and kind of like have this kind of backward trend on how things used to be, right?
Right.
Where it was like groups of people that just believed this way. Like, so if you were a Christian, you just believed this way. If you were, a historian, or just any particular genre, this is just how scientists believe. This is just how historians believe.
Right.
I do think that that there will be some of that, right? I do think that some of us are going to kind of tap out and say, hey, this is just it, right? But no, I think that this thing is just gonna move forward, and I think we're just all gonna devour each other. I mean, it's sad, but I do. I think that, I mean, I really do think we're on our way to an apocalypse. I really do. I'm not a conspiracy theorist at all, guys. Like, I am not like one of these, like, oh, what's gonna happen? Like, this crazy thing is going to happen. I just think you can look at the writing on the wall and see that it's too much. Our minds are going to explode.
Right. Yeah. No, I think at the core, it's just to say that, like, it's something interesting about human beings. This might be very easily backed up in psychology, which I think there has been some studies done to sort of suggest this. I think some of where I've heard it most recently is just when it comes to like dating in relationships, right? And I think right now what you see, especially, and this is a great topic, I won't go down this road, but how social media has affected the dating world. Quick synopsis is 25, 30 years ago, right? Actually, let's go back way further. Let's go back 1,000 years ago, right? No cars, right? There wasn't an easy way to get around, right? So you dated people within the 100 people that you knew within your village, right? As you progress and now transportation becomes more readily available, now you date a little bit. You date maybe up to 200 miles, right? Your dating pool increases by 200 miles. Fast forward to today, we have planes, we have cars. I can get on the other side of the world in less than a day, right? With social media, your dating pool is literally now the entire world for the most part, right? And so what that psychologically can do, just thinking about it, just in a commonsensical kind of way, is to say that, like, when you find somebody in a dating aspect that you love and appreciate, at what point do you go, well, on social media, right, I could probably do better, right? Like, and so I think the element of what you're saying can be extended across the board in different disciplines and all those kinds of things, because it's, even if we have a good idea, our minds will maybe always at some point kind of go, well, can't we do a little better, right? And I'm saying, like, can't we do right? And then, like you said, then you can start getting this devouring, this vicious cycle of destroying a good set standard that you developed, right? And eating the snake sort of eating its tail kind of thing. It's just like, well, you have to, in order,
never be enough.
Yeah, it'll never be enough. And you have to develop a standard somewhere. And the interesting thing to me in thought is, I think if we talk to anybody reasonable and you ask them, are you perfect? Right? I think everybody will say, no, I'm not perfect. Everybody makes mistakes. Right? But when we talk about thinking or holding positions or getting into debates or arguments and all those kinds of things, we rarely take that philosophy onto ourselves and say, you know what, maybe I could be wrong. You know what I'm saying, about these things, right? And as a result of that, we're moving slowly away from being able to be happy with setting some standard, right?
Yeah.
And so, I just kind of want to throw that in there because I think that's a good, that just happened. What you said was perfect, right? And I think that's exactly. I mean, it's no way we're, you know what I'm saying, like,
it's no way. And I think we should, right? I think that we all should, at some point, say, okay, this is just the way that I'm going to live, period.
Right.
Like, there's just no more to it. Like, this is who I'm comfortable with dating. This is who, I'm going to be a traveler. I'm going to be a this, I'm going to be a that. But I don't know. It's so hard to say because the information is just coming so quick, and every idea and everything just seems better and quicker and faster. So people, and we can't, as humans, process all that. So it's like a drug almost. So it's like,
absolutely.
Oh, give me more. I want more. So it's like, when does it all end?
Yep.
Well, I just think, we're going to explode. You know that emoji that has the explode?
Right.
That's going to be us all in like
Right.
another, I don't know, 10 minutes. Like,
Yeah.
seriously,
Any day now, actually, it could happen any
any
day.
day now.
Yeah. No, exactly. I completely agree. Okay, so let's do this real fast. I know there were a couple of posts that we had that you'd sent me that we wanted to kind of sort of discuss and sort of give a take on. And it's interesting because, like you said, we're preachers kids, and come from a Christian background, a Christian perspective, and we are Christian, right? And so it's great to you can rag on your own, right? I think,
Yes,
and
yes.
that's so I think some of these are more on the religious, have the religious undertone to them. So do
So
you want?
forgive us, y'all. Like, we
Yeah.
can't help it. Like, we're just preachers' kids.
Right.
Everything goes back to church. Everything goes back to God and Christianity and Bible. But,
Right.
we're not sticks in the mud, right?
Right.
Like, we get it. We get it.
Right.
So, yeah. So we can start with this one. And again, of course, it has a religious undertone. So all our topics will not have religious
Right.
undertones, even though we probably will come back to
Right.
it. But
Right.
anyway,
All genres. Nobody's safe on this podcast.
exactly. So maybe we could start here. This is one of the ones that I texted you. I said, in the comments, right? The comments to these are just always awesome. But one I found interesting was we can start here. Until God is enough, nothing else will ever be.
All right. So let's.
Until God is enough, nothing else
Okay.
will ever be.
Right. Okay. So I'm gonna try to feed into a little bit of what my podcast is intended to do through this discussion. So let's start with what do you think they're trying to say? Oh, actually,
For
what do you?
me,
Hold on. Actually, tell me what your take is on it. Do you think it's dumb? Do you think it's like? Do you think it's smart? Do you think it's wise? Do you think it? Would you put this quote on your wall? You know what I'm saying? Like, because that's what these kind of are, right? Like, if you look at exactly what it looks like, and I could probably show you guys what the post usually looks like. I don't know if you guys can see that. Um, I'll rerun this back. But you'll see those on social media all the time. You probably couldn't see it, Ray, because I wasn't sharing my screen with you,
okay.
but you'll see those. Like that's like somebody posts. It's like on your wall on your Instagram profile, right? So
Yeah.
what?
Let me see. What did I say? What did I write to you when I sent that to
you? Right, because that's sort of the yeah. So what'd you say?
Oh, I said to you, I was like, not necessarily true.
Right. Right, exactly. Right. So like in that, so if I'm scrolling my social media, and I'm just laymanly scrolling through my social media, and I see a post like that, my immediate response will be, I agree with that, or I completely disagree with that, or I don't believe in God, so this is completely stupid, right? Anything on the spectrum, right? Your response was, it's not necessarily true, right? Which means that it's part of it you agree with, part of it you don't agree with, or maybe whoever wrote it didn't quite capture sort of what you think the truth of that statement is. Right. So why'd you say so? Okay. So what about it? Do you agree with? What do you like about it?
So first of all, I would never post anything like this on my Instagram. I think it's very incomplete.
Right.
So I think that I think a few things about it, but one of the things that I think is that, like, first of all, who wrote this, right? Like, because to me, like, who strung these words together and posted this?
Before you continue with the explanation, that's a profound point because when I'm having discussions with people or debate or in an argument or something like that, people default to vaguity, right? We'll say things like, they, or the people or society or those kinds of buzz terms. And my thought is always to challenge the vaguity of it and to say, well,
Mm-hmm.
who said that? Because it's not just like it's different. Like if you come across a post like this and it's a Bible quote, right? It's just like, okay, we have at least some context. It comes from the Bible, and you can kind of go to the Bible, read it, in context, maybe read some commentaries. Like there's a huge amount of information out there on that verse, if it will be a verse, right? On something like this, we have no idea who wrote it, right? It's we don't know if it came from Instapray, which is, I think, the tagline that has it, but they might not have originated. They might have just shared it, or they might have copied it. You know what I'm saying? So it's from an intellectual perspective. When you talk about, like, at least from the Bible, you can kind of sort of trace back the history of the Bible, the tradition, the oral tradition, the manuscripts, etc. Right? Like there's a huge intellectual field out there to discuss such things. With this, especially because of social media, it's like, let's just say in 100 years, will they be able to archaeologically dig, hypothetically, right, and figure out where this originated? And you know what I'm saying? Like, so,
Yeah.
like you said, to your point, who's that? Like, who wrote this? Right?
Who wrote this?
Who wrote this? Right?
And what exactly were they? Because did they just string some words together
Right.
just to
Always
get eyes on it? Because it sounds like,
it
sounds good. It sounds cool enough that people will like it.
Right.
1000%. And I think that's the issue. I think I just want people to think higher. Right. Think better, like think not better, but think more efficiently about how we insert or digest some of these things.
Right.
That we like. And my hope and my prayer for people is to create your own template for what you digest, and don't just take it as this is not the Bible. Like, right. That quote is not going to get you. It is going to be a fleeing. It's going to be such a short satisfaction. That you gain from that. So I've talked to people, and I promise you, people literally talk now in quotes. Like they talk in memes. Like they conversate via Facebook, like what they heard or what they read. Because people say, oh yeah, that's like the Facebook post. And I immediately, in my brain, I stop listening. I'm like, I cannot put my all or faith or understanding into what Facebook says. What do you think?
Right. And
what do you think about that?
Right. And like we mentioned before, like you said, and I think the greatness of what you said is to say it's not necessarily true, right? A post like this, unfortunately, to your point, is missing context. We don't know who said it. We don't know why they said it. We don't know what they mean, right? And so something can be true, but that doesn't mean it can't be challenged, right? And so even if you come across a post, and let's just say we had the context. Let's say we dug into this, we found out who said it and wrote it, and we interviewed them on this podcast. But what do you mean by that? And they gave us the full context, and we were like, I completely agree with it now. You know what I'm saying? Like, that you can still, when you see something like this, still challenge the thought and the idea, right? And as long as you do that soundly, right? And so with that, what do you think is correct about it? And then what do you think?
That is what you asked me, didn't you?
Well, we went up at a tangent, but I was like, I gotta pause. You said something really good, so we had to go through
it. Yeah, and that's my bad too, right? So I just think that when it says until God is enough, nothing else will ever be. Well, I think that there's a whole bunch of people who don't have God, who feel like they have enough, or they feel like they're okay. So I think when I see something like this, for me, right, I know, because I am saved, that statement is partly true, because I do need God.
Right.
But when it says nothing else would ever be, it's like nothing else will ever be. But what else? But there has to be, because and it's all in how you define God and his
Right.
image,
Right.
and
Right.
because God made everything.
Mm.
So I have to have stock in something else because
Mm-hmm.
God gave us, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, other things that he shows himself through.
Right. Mm.
So I could get caught up wrong,
Mm-hmm.
right? And say, God, I gotta have God, I gotta have God.
Mm.
But God is flowers,
Right.
right?
Right.
God is love.
Mm-hmm.
God is so many other things
Mm.
and in so many other forms. So
Mm-hmm.
I could be missing God
Mm-hmm.
and have God,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And be missing it
Mm.
because I'm so busy looking for this idea
Mm-hmm.
of what society or Facebook has told me God is.
Right.
So then it starts to make you question, like, well, what is God? That's what I would want. My prayer for folks would be to then question, well, what is God?
Mm-hmm.
And how do I accept and how do I know if I have him?
Mm.
That would be what I would challenge and what my prayer for folks would be.
Right.
Because what it kind of insinuates is I gotta have God or else I will never be quote unquote happy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's partly true,
Mm-hmm.
but the way it sounds on the ear is kind of missing that God is many forms.
Mm-hmm.
He is all things. So without that knowledge, you could get lost in
Mm.
just just trying to understand and massage and process that particular post. So that was like
Right.
a whole breakdown, y'all.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
but if I looked at this post, I would flip right, like all of that would have gone through my mind, and then I would have flipped right through it and not liked it because
Mm.
that post to me is incomplete for that reason,
Mm-hmm.
for
Right.
those reasons.
Right. And I think what will happen on a podcast like this as more and more people start to view the podcast, right? Which is what the podcast is intended to do. It's intended to take your idea. So we have this post, you have a perspective and you've drawn a conclusion about it, right? And that conclusion comes through the lens of your perspective on your experience of your life and your background and your values and what you believe. And what will then happen is then people will want to know more essentially about your view on, like you were kind of going into a little bit about what is God, what do you believe, right? Because on the
Oh,
one hand, right, you have people out there who are like, well, I'm Christian too, right? Because you mentioned like there are people out there who don't have God, right? And you probably could take that two ways: those who are believers who are seeking God, and those who are non-believers who aren't seeking God, right? But then you have the other side where you have people out there who are Christians who believe they have God, and then their perspective on that might be different from what you were saying, right? Like for instance, I almost already can tell, like when you say God is flowers, right? Somebody's gonna maybe take that and look at that and say, okay, what do you mean by God is flowers, right? In a sense that, or this sort of very open spirituality idea that's in our culture today, right? Which is just like, well, God's the universe, so to speak. There's a lot of talk about manifesting and those kinds of things, and that's permeating the culture right now too, right? So you'll get probably from both sides a perspective in terms of like, okay, well, you said this, you're Christian. How would you ground that sort of in your Christian, Christian perspectives? Probably is a question that's probably more rooted in the like tradition of Christianity, so to speak, right? And then you could go down the rabbit hole in terms of like the Bible, where it comes from, and all of that stuff. And then the other side, where it's just like there'll be people out there who definitely will agree with you, but in discussion with them, you'll be like, well, I didn't mean that. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah,
and that's what
yeah,
happens on social media.
yeah,
Like, and so
yeah.
I think
And that's the importance of having conversations too,
absolutely,
and to have these ongoing conversations. Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely, because my perspective on it is what I like about the quote, or not like about it. Well, let me say it. First off, I think the pro, which oddly enough about this kind of thing is the pro is, there takes a bit of bravery. I think in today's society, first and foremost, to speak about God in general, right? Like I think traditionally it was like, okay, well, there was a point where religion was on top and people who weren't religious on the bottom. I think right now the world is becoming more secular in many ways, because I think we're starting to now, and what we were talking about when in terms of like exactly what social media does, it starts to stretch ideas sometimes so far where you start to miss the mark and it starts to become a self-defeating sort of argument, right? And so I think God and spirituality, those things are combining. People out there are saying like, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, right? That's probably another quote out there somewhere on one of these boards. You know what I'm saying? Like, or somebody's like, I'm Christian, but I'm not religious. That kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And those kind of things, those would be great topics of conversation.
They would be.
Right.
They would be.
But like a quote like this, so at a very base level, I can salute the boldness that it takes to put something out there like this, even though we don't know who they are. Yeah. So were they really that bold? No, I'm kidding. Maybe it was Instagram that originated. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. But there's a boldness there. So that I think should be commended to some degree. What I think, at least when I read this, the silver lining person in me wants to say, okay, if you're making a reference, for instance, to biblical law, right? The first and great commandment is to essentially put God first, right? Thou shalt love the Lord your God with all your mind, heart, soul, mind, and strength, right? And so to take that, but that gives you context though, right? That gives you a context that this doesn't necessarily have, right? Because within the framework of the law, in that perspective, that's God giving the law to his people, right? And that has like I said, a context there that has a lot of different stuff you have to consider and think about. And while that does drive forth the thought, like you said, and you said like, okay, like I know what you mean when you say, okay, you do need God, right? Because that's foundational to your belief system. So the silver lining is like, okay, if that's their angle, then okay, I can get with it. But to your point though, because it's missing that context, I can't expect that everybody's going to see it that way, right? And then that's obviously when the discussion has to happen. And like you said, what I don't like about it as well too is just the missing context. Nothing. What do you mean nothing else will be, right? Do you trust, for instance, that which God has given you, which is kind of sort of the point, right? If you're a believer, it's like, well, God has given me some things, right, to use, even if that means getting closer to him through the utilization of those things, right? Yeah. And so the danger is it can put you in a mindset that starts to stretch the idea further than what the idea is intended to be, right? If you're coming from more, basic understanding, like if you're, kind of referencing it to the first commandment, so to speak, you know what I'm saying? So no, I think this is good.
No, yeah, I think that's a great kind of foundational point. And you spoke earlier about the reliability, right, of what you think. Like, is it reliable? And I think that's a great kind of defense to, hey, why this is a good post or bad post, right? And maybe that's an angle too we could take on some of these like in the future. Yeah. Good post, right. Bad post, right. Just something that simple. Yeah. For me, as soon as I see something that's talking about God or speaks about really God, I was going to say religion, but not so much God, I literally start to like pick it apart because I'm always thinking about what someone will take from that. Absolutely. And what are they going to rest there? Because I think that's one of the reasons why some of our people are so fundamentally not sound. They continue to kind of go through the same things over and over because I don't think that there's a certain deepness. They aren't studied. They aren't challenging words enough and going and grabbing the information that they need. So I think people rest
Yeah.
on that kind of one level way of thinking.
Yep.
And I'm like, yikes, but that's not going to keep you.
Yeah.
That kind of
Yep.
one-dimensional thinking. You're gonna need much more than that, babe.
Yep.
I heard somebody say Miss Mamas, like that's the new thing on social media now. I saw it's like girl, or child. It's like Miss Mamas or niece.
Right.
No, niece, you're gonna need more than that. You're
Right.
gonna need more than that to sustain you
Yep.
because you're gonna keep on going through
Mm.
and over and over. If you don't have a template to challenge what you hear, to
Right.
challenge what's around you,
Right.
you got to be able to hold on to something or you're gonna be mixed up.
Yeah.
And with that,
Yeah.
I digress. I'll
Yeah.
let you jump in.
You know what? This is exactly kind of sort of what I wanted from this episode too. We're cooking now, right? Because there's so many
Okay.
ideas. we're cooking, right? Because um I think the interesting thing I think about Christianity in the Bible is when you read it and you read it in a, like you said, a more studied perspective, right? I think the Bible calls for Christians to come from a studied perspective, right? It's a very complex book, right?
Yeah.
The stories themselves, they take a very short story in the Bible and take Noah's Ark. You know what I'm saying? Like the story of Noah. It doesn't cover an entire chapter, right? It's in Genesis. It's a couple chapters. But there's so much complexity there that if you don't study it, you're gonna miss components and things that are gonna now then make reference later in the Bible. In the New Testament, if they make a reference to Noah, you might not quite get it, you might not quite understand it. And so I think sort of what you're saying, and I'm gonna ask you a question right after this, is the approach that sometimes people can take, not from a Christian perspective in general, which is what this podcast is intended to help people learn how to stay away from, is lazy thinking, right? And it's to say, I have this thing that can substitute work, right? And I think from a biblical perspective, God tells people that they're going to have to work, right? And work is it's a big topic biblically, because it's not work to simply achieve, food, clothing, housing, and the things that money will be able to purchase as a result of working, but rather it's more in the experience of God itself, right? Because God worked when He created the heavens and the earth and through the creation story. So there's just throwing it out there to say that there's complexity. There's such a complexity there that if you just simply take an idea that you just read, or you have a sort of lazy way of thinking, can lead you astray, right? In what you're saying. And so the question I was going to pose to you was going to be, okay, so what's your foundational, like, when you look at this and you challenge this, like you said, when you read a post like this, you immediately sort of put on a skeptical lens, right? Where do you think that skeptical lens has its base? Like, what's the core of that skepticism for you, right?
Or just,
I would say, what's the first thing? What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about that, right? Like, I don't necessarily want to box you into any particular way of thinking, of breaking that down. But yeah, what do you think about?
tell me the question one more time.
Yeah, no worries. So it's
I'm
essentially,
sorry.
you're saying, like, when you scroll and you see
Listen, my brother, listen, let me tell you something about my little brother. He is very super, super smart. So whenever I feel like these are going to be my special glasses, so whenever I feel like I have to be super smart, like, I'm going to put these on. These make me think like on his level. Okay.
Right. Well,
Okay, little brother, go ahead.
I would say about my smart, like I always say, it's not that I'm smart. It's just that, like, I take a keen interest in being smart. You know what I'm saying? So I'm not saying that, oh, like, I have a high IQ. It's more so than saying, like, I'm really interested in smart things. And so because I'm interested in it, okay, so I digress there.
But that means his IQ is probably really high, y'all. So
I honestly haven't
we're just
taken an
gonna
IQ
we're
test
just
in a
gonna
long
let him
time.
have that.
But like, okay, so what you were saying about, like, when you scroll through social media and you see a post and you see God in the post, right? You have an instant reaction, and whether you're doing this consciously or subconsciously, I think it's probably a lot of it's subconscious, right?
Yeah,
Because
a lot of it is.
right, because I do the same thing because I'm Christian, right? And so I know that people use Christianity as a weapon. That's like one of my first things that comes to mind, right? And so when I see a Christian post, I'm like, are Christians, what do they add this time, right? Are they offending somebody? Are they doing something with malice? You know what I mean? Like, and so that comes to mind. Then there is, the not contextual Christian message, like maybe something that this post is kind of sort of doing a little bit, maybe, you know what I'm saying, without the proper context. I can view it in a positive light if I'd like to, like I was saying before, and say, okay, if I link it back to this, then I can see what it's going with, but I can also see the perspective that it might be a lazy way of thinking in it if you those kinds of things. So when you see those posts, when you're scrolling, you see a post that has God in it, or it's a reference to, Christianity from a religious perspective or a spiritual perspective, what's in you that challenges that? Like, what do you think is your most basic or profound mode of being that says, let me check this out? You know what I'm saying?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Probably my, I don't know, probably my hermeneutics, to be honest with you, because I look at this post and I say it makes absolutely no sense at all. Like, it doesn't really make sense. Like, you have to bring something to it. It's like abstract. It's like I have to bring something to it in order to make sense of it, because if I just read the words for what it says, it's not really sound throughout it. And I can just tell by looking at it. It's kind of, it doesn't make a lot of sense, really, when you break it down. I understand what the writer is saying, and I get it. It's cute enough, right? And I get what his intentions were,
right?
But it doesn't say anything. It doesn't really tell anybody anything. So for me, I just scroll right past it.
Right.
Because again, I don't get anything from it. I don't get any motivation from it. It doesn't make me want to know more. It's not funny. It's not quirky. It doesn't keep my interest. So I'm go, oh.
Right. So here's actually,
what is this even?
Here's actually a really good question, actually. Do you think objectively it's a bad quote or a bad post, or do you think it's just not for you?
It's not for me. And no, objectively, it is not a bad post.
And that's a good distinction to make too, right? Because I think that, like, so even when you're having discussions with people, like when sometimes we speak, especially when we have a position on something, when we speak sort of authoritatively, right? Which tends to come off objectively. It's just like, I can if let's just say, our brother Sarah, let's just say he bought a red car, and I'm just like, when I see the red car, I'm like, dude, it would be better in black. That's really a subjective position, right? But he might hear that and be like, are you saying that the car is just better in black, right? And I think that can be very confusing sometimes, because while I stated my opinion, it might not necessarily sound, because our minds and our psyches, sometimes when we, especially people we care about, when they say things, it's almost a subconscious direct challenge to who we are, because they know us so well, you know what I'm saying? And so it can be hard to delineate between I'm making an objective claim, or this is just my taste, right? And so even something like that has to, like, just say that's just there, but that was the post that we came across where it was like, cars are better in black. You know what I'm saying? Like, really? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Really, it's subjective, but it sounds objective, right? Because it's like, you're putting that out there now. It's in the public. You didn't just keep it to yourself. So now you want people to know that you think cars are better in black, which kind of sounds like you're making an objective claim. You know what I'm saying? But it doesn't necessarily have to be that.
And I think too, what the messenger is really saying is, the message really is saying, for me, the message should be saying, and I know y'all, maybe we shouldn't include the second half. Maybe we should just get some different posts, because I don't want folks thinking that we are always going to be like this deep about any particular post. So let's talk about this footage. um, really what the post should be saying is something like, until you are saved, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
until you are studied, or until you have accepted Jesus as your personal savior,
Mm,
dot, 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 you will never be whatever the rest of the post says, right?
hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what, so to me, it's a confusing, conflicting message because for me, I have to bring something to it. So you're saying until I have God, and it's like, well, wait, hold on. Everybody technically has God because God made us all. So
Mm-hmm.
what do you mean have God? Can we
Mm-hmm.
have God,
Mm-hmm.
or are we just born with, like, what does that imply?
Right. Right.
So, it's the study in me, right? It's the
Yeah.
hermeneutics in me that makes me question the first part, which makes me not even want to listen to the second part, which is what keeps me scrolling.
Right. No, that's extremely profound because you also mentioned I first asked you about the post as well. You said like, um, you were saying something along the lines of that there are people out there who don't have God, right? And I think in what you just said there is a point of clarity as well too, is because you're right, and what you're saying is say I think what it should say is until you have Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, until you're saved. That brings about a very Christian context. And now
Yes.
everybody can even the most staunch non-believer understands, right, what you're saying when you put it that way, right?
Hmm.
Even if they don't
Which is
agree, even if they
probably
don't
why
believe.
they said God
Right.
and
Right.
not Jesus.
Hmm.
Because first of all, if you're human, you
Mm-hmm.
have some level of God because we all know
Right.
that you came from somewhere, whether or not you want to call it God or not.
Mm.
Some people want to say the universe, like you mentioned earlier today,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't know about the universe just birthing people.
Right. Right.
And then who made the universe, right? So we can
Right.
have that conversation.
Right.
But it's I kind of lost my point, but yeah, so it's this kind of what you have to bring to these posts. I don't know if people really have it to bring to it.
Right.
So I think that post, maybe that's another segment, right? We do something and we correct
Mm-hmm.
Facebook
Right. Yeah.
as to
Yeah.
what I think they are actually meaning.
Mm.
Do I understand what he meant or he or she meant by writing this? Absolutely, because I do believe that you can't, you're never going to be happy until you do something that we talked about earlier, right? Until there is a moment, a standard, a
Mm-hmm.
point in time where
Yep.
you say, look, this is just it for me. I
Yep.
have accepted enough ideas. I have done enough study.
Mm-hmm. You got to
This is
choose.
going to
Yep.
be it.
Yep.
So until you have that, right, whatever we're calling that, or that, whatever that is,
Yep.
you probably won't ever, you know, nothing will probably ever be enough.
Right.
So so then there's that, right?
Yeah.
There's that.
Yeah, that's so. Yeah, that's. It's there's so many. This is why I love discussion because you can take just a very simple thing and just expand it because to your point, right? Like they probably meant that, right? And you're taking it now. You're saying God is essentially serving the purpose of being in someone's life or perspective an ultimate standard, right? And until you draw
Yeah.
near to what that standard is, you can define properly what that standard is. How can you be happy in any other form with anything else, right?
Yeah.
And so no, that's extreme. That's very profound, right? And also comes down to the definition of what do you mean by God, like you said before. But no, that's that's so good. No, I
Yeah.
love that. Yeah. No, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And two, I just want to clarify too. Earlier I said, everybody doesn't have God. And then later on, I said kind of like everybody does have God.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just about what you're bringing to the conversation. Because I could probably argue both points
Right. Yep.
about having God versus not having God.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, it's this whole notion and idea about having God. Like,
Mm.
what does that actually mean?
Right.
Um,
Yep.
so you have to take a certain position in order to kind of think that thing through.
Right.
Um,
Yep.
So yeah, we could go on and on about it.
Yep.
But I do want to clarify that I wasn't kind of speaking out of both sides.
Yeah,
I
for sure.
think you could kind of think about it this way,
Yeah.
bringing something to that abstract painting.
Yep.
You can think about it this way, or you can think about it that way.
Right.
Um,
Yep.
if I go to my biblical mind, it's going to make me think, having God, I don't know, that's like bigger than our minds can really
Hmm.
understand. If
Right.
you really want to break down having God,
Right. Yep.
having God,
Yeah.
ah,
No, yeah, I know what you mean.
right,
Yeah. Yep.
like
Yep.
yikes.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. And I think that we'll maybe have a I know we've been talking a lot about Christianity, but again, this podcast, this particular episode is not specific. We're just Christians, right? So we're bringing the Christian perspective, and it's which is actually it should have gone that way as well too, right? Because the point is when people come on, I would want them to have their wear their perspective on their sleeve or their foundation or their worldview, right? And then we discuss, and because we're both Christian, it just is
Right.
that way. But we can have a more Christian discussion in another podcast as well when we talk about the specifics of the Christian perspective on some of these things, right? And we can get deeper into talking about a scripture or a verse or using something, like that to sort of back up some of the things that we're saying or what we're projecting and claiming here.
Yeah.
Let's do one more, and then I think we
Okay.
could probably start to wrap it up a bit and then kind of go into
Sure.
conclusions. But I think we had one more. Did you want to read that one? I might be able to show everybody.
No, it's
This.
another God one.
Yeah.
Another
fine.
Christian one.
Perfectly fine.
So here it is. It says, if you're unsure,
Here we go. Yep.
pray. Maybe we shouldn't talk about this tonight because I can literally talk on this one for an hour. And if you go to the post that I actually sent you, it's one of those
Oh,
like
yeah, I can see it.
ones
Yep.
with the
Yeah.
so when you wake up, pray.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
When life gets hard, pray. Maybe.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
If you're unsure, pray.
Mm-hmm.
That one's the one we are going to focus on. When you're happy, pray.
Right. That actually.
God's always with us. So we could just focus on if you're unsure, pray.
Okay.
So let me just bite into this really quickly.
All right.
And maybe we should talk about this one tonight.
We can save it if you want. And I'll leave it to you. You're the
maybe we'll go out with a maybe a cliffhanger. Maybe we'll go out on this.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's good. I like that. Yeah.
I think that I have very definite thoughts about this.
Okay.
I think that this is, again, one of those traditions when you talk about prayer, right? That, again, makes my point about people getting caught up in traditions that may not necessarily work. Because there isn't necessarily one way to approach God if you are unsure. So one, I think this begets, right, a certain conversation that if you're unsure, the only solution to that is prayer. So it isn't necessarily wrong, but I think that there's a more effective, a more efficient way to approach God when you are unsure. So me, myself, as I'm going through my journey, and I have been journeying for the last 4 years now, going on 5, one of the things that I learned about was meditation and worship. Let's start with worship, because worship has a specific function in the Bible. So then I could argue and say, if I'm unsure, have I worshiped? Because if I worshiped, I wouldn't be unsure, which could beg a question, then what do we pray for?
Right.
What is the significance? When do we pull out our prayer tool versus, or the not versus, but and the juxtaposition between prayer, worship, if the subject is I'm unsure.
Right.
So I have very definite opinions about this, and I will say this, and then I'll let you get a word in edgewise.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that even though the Bible says pray without ceasing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that that is a true statement.
Mm-hmm.
What I want believers and maybe whoever to know is that if you worship, you will need to pray less. And that's not to say that, but see, then we got to talk about then what do we use prayer for if the Bible talks about prayer, right? And but I think in how we are digesting this information, we need to have more clarity. We need to have more understanding. We need to have more just more meat behind when we're digesting and ingesting some of these things that we're seeing and reading, because you can pray without ceasing. I'm praying until I'm blue in the face. I would assert that if you're praying, and you're still unsure, you might need to try a different approach.
Right.
And I think that if we're worshiping the way that we should worship, the way that the Bible speaks about worship and the function of worship, I believe that you are less unsure if you have a worship life. So I thought about all that when I saw this post.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of profoundness in that for sure. 1,000%. That is a good cliffhanger. Let's definitely dig more into that. I could say more. I could say exactly what I could tell you why I agree with that from the prayer element that you said when you use the Bible quote to pray without ceasing, right? In other words, that prayer is at least at a base level how we essentially prepare or humble ourselves to commune with God in the sense that I heard somebody say, and I've never forgot this quote: prayer is not our vision or our imagination of God. In other words, it's not intended for us to, when we pray, to ask God for things, right? It's our imagination of God. Hey, God, I need a house. I need a good job. I need this. I need that. But rather, it's God's vision of us, right? That it's the beginning of our recognition of the holiness of God, right? The beginning of the Lord's Prayer says, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." The first thing is acknowledgement, right, of God's absolute holiness. And so I could say more on that. Let's definitely dig into that topic a little bit more because I know you have plenty. We've had some conversations about that before, but let's click on that. What I want to ask is, would you ever post things like this? Not these posts specifically, but would you ever have like a quote that you put out there into the social media ether, right? Because what's interesting is that like I'm with you when it's like, okay, when I see a post, especially one with God in it, I look at it and I challenge it. So on the flip side, it's like, but you can appreciate like I said, the boldness of it and the push of idea or that modern thought where it's just like, I have something I would like to say and I want to share it with people. And I can't, if this was an entire chapter of the Bible, nobody's going to read it, right? Like it was just like just paragraph on paragraph, but a 3-word, 20-word excerpt, people will read it, right? And so the question is would you ever do anything like this on your social media?
This question. I would not post anything like this on my social media. My social media would have to consist of my template on what God gives me it wouldn't be kind of this kind of like I don't know, cookie cutter type of 1, 2, 3. No, it would have to be an authentic thought.
Right.
So I guess maybe this is somebody's authentic thought. So
Right. Right.
okay, so
Right.
in that regard, maybe then maybe my answer should be yes. Maybe I would, but it would be thoughts that are God given, right? Or something that I have experienced, on my, for myself, that I would then translate into a post of this nature. So a post of this nature, I would never share. I would never share it on my stories. I wouldn't repost it. No,
Right.
I would not.
If the answer, the part of you that says yes, what would you post? Would it be, and it could be, so like, it could be something like you said, pray without ceasing, right? Like that, if you know the Bible verse, you can say Bible verse, which you'll see all the time. You'll see a verse in quotes, and you'll see the Proverbs 13:13 or something like that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Which then people go, okay, I can read that, and then I can go to the reference, right, and get some context. You know what I'm saying? And you know what I'm saying? But so, what part of you that says yes? What would you post, or what would that post look like?
Oh, that's a great question. I would probably say, if you're unsure, worship.
I love it.
I would not say pray.
Right.
I would not say pray.
Right.
And we could definitely get into some of those reasons at a later time, because I have
sure.
very definite opinions about prayer versus worship and their function.
Awesome. No, I love it. Yeah, we're approaching. That was a good conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We will definitely do this again. This is part 1 of a million. Having me post that we can.
However long he'll have me on till I
like that's enough.
Until his big sister, till his big sister outweighs her welcome.
That will never happen. But no, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Sure. We love these kinds of discussions. This is a great first discussion to have, especially with you. You're beautiful. You have amazing ideas. You have always been an inspiration to me. Hopefully this podcast you'll get an opportunity through your thoughts and what you were saying and talking about, that you'll inspire others as well, because that's ultimately what we're trying to do. We're trying to help people think about thinking, which ultimately helps them, and hopefully that will inspire them to then go throughout their life and actually try to challenge themselves internally first, so that their authenticity in the truth of what they say that they believe in and where they come from actually shines bright, and they can actually have something to say, or they will challenge themselves enough to align themselves closer to what the truth actually is. And I think that's what we're trying to do here. And I think this is a great first discussion for many more in the future to come. Any last thoughts?
I mean, this is just amazing. Micah, these conversations are not unlike just our family conversations. Like, this is just kind of how, like, the platform, or the way in which my family just interacts. Right. So it was amazing being here with you. I think you're a great podcaster. I think you're a great thinker. I think you're a great example on so many different levels. And I just want your podcast to grow. My prayers that your podcast grows to however many number of people you want it to be.
Yep.
I hope it's ends up being everything you want it to be, and I think it's going to be amazing. I think just stay doing what you're doing.
Yep.
Don't change. Continue to just do you, and your audience is going to find you. Yep. So I'm super proud of you. Thank you for having me. Guys, we're going to try to get some, maybe some lighthearted some posts next time, because we definitely don't want to, we want to be engaging. We want to be entertaining. We want you guys to keep coming back. But I do think we have so much going on in the world that we do need to consider things on a deeper level. Absolutely. And if you get 1,000 followers, if you get 100,000 followers, if you get 1,000, then guess what? Then we're helping
What it is. Yep.
1,000,
Absolutely.
and that's going to be okay as well. So
Yep.
I'm super proud of you.
Thank you.
Can't wait till the next time.
Yep.
And yeah, thanks for
Thanks.
having me.
Absolutely. Perfect. Thanks, everybody. God bless. Have a good night. We'll catch you on the next one.